You guys, I had no idea how much responsibility came with being an adult. I don't even have kids yet. I had no idea. It was funny. I had no idea that, here's what I didn't think about. What they don't tell you is, they tell you how much a house costs to get it. But they don't tell me how much it'll cost to keep it. No. In so many different things, I've noticed in the year 2020, I felt that God was doing so much on the inside of me. I really felt like I was going to ascend near the new year to this place of complete freedom. I mean, I really thought that. I thought that I might just get raptured by the year. By December 29th, I thought I was out of here, man. I really did, because I felt like God was doing so much in me and in our community. But it was interesting because I noticed, and I didn't notice when it first happened, but I felt that I was growing so much, and yet near the end of the year, I had this very intense mental exhaustion moment. This moment where it's just too much to manage. You ever felt that way? And the parents are looking at me like, you don't even know. You don't even know. I remember doing the same thing in high school. I remember my parents would always say that same thing, like, you don't even know. You think you have all this responsibility, but you don't have any. But in that time, it was so serious for me. I mean, that doesn't invalidate what high schoolers go through. Is really, really intense. It's intense. And given it's intense to your level of capacity, but it's still real. It's still very, very real. But that being said, it's interesting the management that came with certain blessings that I prayed for, and yet now I find myself complaining about the things that I once prayed for. It's this weird irony. I prayed for a church, but I had no idea what that would entail. I prayed for a marriage, I had no idea what that would entail. I prayed for a house, I had no idea what that would entail. But I think I found myself, and remember, we're going through a series right now, whenever I'm speaking, called House Party, because God is in the frequency of heaven throwing a party in his house. That the Bible ends with a giant multicultural feast, a giant massive. That is how the whole story of the Bible ends. All of the nations, everyone will say all. It's important. All the nations come into the kingdom. And in this kingdom, it's just a party. That's all that it is. It's a massive feast. And I look at that and it sounds just like the epitome of freedom. It does. All of us feasting, eating, flying, I don't know, doing whatever we want to do. It sounds like that. But in God's house, I noticed this throughout the year 2020. I've learned so much about my house. That my house, my wife, it's a gift having an interior designer as a wife, because she's made our house into a place that I find a lot of sanctuary in. It's an intimate place for me. It's very, very intimate. And I think our houses are intimate places for all of us. You don't really just invite anyone over to your house. Why? Just because I just don't know you, honestly. And there's something about having people in my house. There's a space where, honestly, it requires respect in someone else's house. You don't just go into someone else's house and do whatever you want to do. If they invited you, and especially if they paid for the food, you do not go, you kind of go in there with a little bit of humility at least. Like, I'm here on your invitation, and I know, I sound like such a snob, I know I do, but I'm just saying what a lot of people are thinking. That it's true, there is a respect that is, honestly, if you come into my house, there is a respect that is expected. It's expected. Because I'm inviting you into my place of vulnerability. You can find out things about me in my house that you couldn't find out outside of it. It's a sacred place, our house. But with that, it's interesting because I want to read from the book of 1 Samuel. This is, as we talked about last time, this is going to be a bonus episode, by the way, in the house party series. I don't know. I wasn't planning on doing only one message this weekend. I was planning on doing the whole weekend. And so I thought tonight we would just give like a bonus episode to House Party. But it's exactly what I needed to hear. I'm going to call this message Party Foul. Party foul was a word that existed around the time I was in high school, and it phased out because it's not really a cool word, but essentially what it means is someone does something cringy or crosses a boundary, or it's just a party foul. It's just something you don't do while at a party. God has some things that he considers party fouls. God has some things inside his house. While there is complete freedom in his home, there is still a few things that he takes very seriously. And here's what I've learned in my journey with God. This is where I currently see things from. Usually, you see this in Scripture, the things that we take seriously, he doesn't seem to take as seriously. Many times the things we think he takes seriously, he doesn't take that serious. We find God in the book of the prophets saying, I'm really tired of your worship songs. I'm tired of them. I don't even want to hear them. You think I like them, but I don't even like them. You don't even know what I value. It's kind of a funny thing, right? It's kind of crazy that he's saying, what they are calling worship, he's like, I don't even care about it. I don't even care. Because you don't even know what worship is. We find this throughout the people of God's history where God reveals himself in a fresh way. They become familiar with that way, and then he has to reveal a new way to them, but he has to allow their system to fall apart. Because whenever God releases a new revelation of himself, what we want to do is immediately build a system. Build a system, build a box. This is how it is. Here's the method. Here's how it happens. Let's carry it on from this way forever on forward. But then it gets a little bit painful because he must crush our system in order to reveal something new about himself. So we're going to open up in a story where he is crushing their system. And I mean, he really crushes it. And it's a very serious story. And honestly, I don't preach very many messages. Usually I'm very aware of a very big joy on the inside of me, but I'm preaching this tonight with a very big sense of warning, a caution. But it's out of goodness. It's out of goodness and it's out of love because I believe in a God who loves humanity more than I can honestly even express to you tonight. Like I'm gonna pale at that. I'm gonna fail at showing you that tonight, honestly. No matter how hard I try, there has to be a miracle on the inside of you to even see a glimpse of how big his love is for you tonight. But in that space, we found out the last time that we talked about this, God started with his chair in his house. When he designs his house, he starts with his throne. This is called the Ark of the Covenant. And what happens, wherever this Ark of the Covenant goes, victory goes with it. every single time. If there's a problem you can't figure out how to face, just pretty much bring the Ark of the Covenant in there and you're going to bring victory to your situation every single time. That's how it works, at least in the very beginning when God gives them this Ark. But as the people of God receive this revelation of himself when he builds a house among them, what ends up happening over the generations is we find a familiarity that is so beyond scary that God must do something to crush their familiarity. We're going to open up in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. This is going to be the first message in the Party Foul series, little mini series or bonus episodes, whatever we want to call it. And this one is going to be about mismanaging freedom. Now the sons of Eli, this is the spiritual leadership of the nation, were worthless men. Dang. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. So what a way to open up about the spiritual leadership of the time. They're worthless and they don't know anything about God, yet they're the spiritual leaders. Cool. Verse 13. The custom of the priests with the people. Everyone say custom. See, that doesn't mean that God gave that custom. This was something that this administration created in God's place. The custom of the priests with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest servant would come while the meat was boiling with a 3-pronged fork in his hand. Verse 14. I know it sounds really weird from the jump, but I'll explain this in a second. And he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. Everyone say for himself. That's a big thing. This is what they did at Shiloh to all, rich and poor, princes, common people, all the Israelites that came to the temple, that came to the house of God. This was the custom. This had become like a law. This is what the temple expected from its people. But watch this, 15. Moreover, so this is an even more serious thing. Moreover, before the fat was burned, this is a massive deal, the priest servant would come and say to the man who was giving something to God, who was sacrificing, give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. Ugh. Only raw meat. I'll explain what that means in a second. Verse, I want to read all the way through though. And if the man said to him, let them burn the fat first. If the person says, actually, the law of God says that the sacrifice should go to God first, and then the priest would get their portion of the meal. The priest was only allowed to have the shoulder of the lamb and the heart of the lamb. Just a reminder, this is our spiritual diet as people of God. It is the heart of the lamb and the strength of the lamb. It is not just God's love, it is God's strength, because they go in tandem. Sometimes it's easy to go on either side of the spectrum and say God is all powerful, but then really negate his love, or say that God is all loving, but then forget his power. I'm grateful today to be talking about a God who is not just able to heal us, but willing to heal us too. Is anybody grateful in the place today that I don't just have a God whose shoulder is for me, I don't just have a God whose power is for me, I have a God whose heart is also for me, and they work in tandem. But if it's not enough, let them burn the fat first. So if the person, this was happening, where the people would come to the spiritual leader and they would say, well, wait a minute, but everything had to be offered to God first. especially the fat on the sacrifice. So if a person says, well, let's offer it to God first, if the person is saying, let's do the right thing, and then take as much as you wish, he would say, look at this spiritual leadership. This is crazy. The amount of abuse going on here. No. You will give the sacrifice now, and if not, I'll take it by force. So we see the spiritual leadership, what they're doing to the people. It's horrible that they're abusing the people. The people are bringing sacrifices, and the priests are taking it all for themselves. Not only are they robbing the people, they're robbing God. They're robbing everybody. And look at how blatant that is. No, you'll give it now, or I'll take it by force. It is forced giving. Forced. You must, or I'll take it. It's crazy stuff that's going on here. Watch this, verse 19. Thus the sin of the young men was everyone say very. Ooh, it's very great in the sight of the Lord, for men treated the offering, that's a big deal, treating the offering of the Lord with contempt. Verse 18. Look at the result of this. This is crazy to me. Actually, I don't know if I gave you that verse, and that's okay. I have it here in my Bible. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. Verse 17, though, in the original, it says that, this is the ESV that you're reading from, but you can also see this in the King James. It says that the people hated the offering of Yahweh. The common people. So the spiritual leadership had created an environment in the nation now, where now the whole nation looks on the worship that's happening, and they all hate it. Everybody hates it. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody actually wants to give something to this administration. And this is a crazy thing, because what this leads to, this is a very multi-layered story, and I'm going to start at the surface today. But essentially, this whole story leads to the people of God losing this. And I just want all of us to really understand how serious that is. That's no joke. This is the throne of, this is symbolic of the throne of God. And what ends up happening throughout this story, through the next 4 chapters, the people think that this, it's a crazy. Actually, I want to jump ahead to chapter 6, just so you can see how lost this spiritual leadership is. These people are gone. These people are gone. 1 Samuel, chapter 6. Stay with me tonight, because I'm going to push it a little bit. If you stay with me, I think you're really going to like this, because I really needed to hear it. I know that I did. That 1 Samuel, chapter 4, the Philistines came out to fight the people. And the Philistines just beat the snot out of them. I mean, they crush them. And so the people ask, well, maybe we should bring the Ark of the Covenant out here, just like it used to work. I know it used to work. We used to bring the Ark of the Covenant out, and it always brought victory. So let's bring the Ark of the Covenant out. Chapter 4, the Philistines, it says that the Ark of the Covenant came into the camp, and all of Israel shouted with a great shout. So if you're in this moment, you're thinking, we're gonna kill them. We're gonna have victory. The Ark of the Covenant is here, but you see this familiarity with it, to the point where these people see the Ark of the Covenant as purely a national symbol, and that's just all that it is. It's a national symbol. This is not where God sits. They're just using this because this was the old method. This is what worked for their forefathers, and so now we're going to do the same thing that they did, and it's going to work again. Why? Because it's a national symbol purely. That's all that it is. In a country like ours, I just want to say this. Don't think that we're not in danger of the same thing. That just because "In God We Trust" was put on our dollar bills does not mean that we actually believe in this. That don't mean a thing. It didn't mean a thing in this story, and it doesn't mean a thing now. What matters is what God is saying in this moment. And what he's saying in this moment, in this story, is crazy. It says there was a great shout. They bring the Ark of the Covenant, this corrupt spiritual leadership. They bring it out and they flaunt it. You can see it. It's crazy. It's crazy what's happening in this because there's all this excitement. There's a great shout in the camp. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, "What means this noise?" This is chapter 4, verse 6. What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean? And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, verse 7, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "A god has come into the camp." They remember. And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before." So they're freaking out. Verse 8. "Woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness." And they're going to get hit with plagues later, just watch. But take courage and be men. Be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men in fight. And it actually works. The Tony Robbins of the Philistines actually got these dudes so hyped. Watch what they do. Watch this. So the Philistines fought and they killed. They crushed. This would have been jarring to be an Israelite and see what happens here. This is one of the greatest tragedies of their history. The Philistines fought and Israel was defeated, and they fled every man to his home. And there was a great slaughter, very great, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell, verse 11. And the ark of God was captured. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So, this leadership gets justice. They do. They get absolutely destroyed. But where it all started was in a party foul. Where this all started was a mismanagement of the house of God. What was the mismanagement? It's what happened in chapter 2. What they were doing here is so extreme, and God took it so seriously because this, when it's delivered to your life, can be either the best thing that happens to you or the worst thing. This. Remember what this represents. This is simply symbolic of the throne of God, the presence of God. What the sons of Eli did not understand was there is a responsibility that comes with this ark. Sure, it brings all freedom and all victory every single time because we find out even when they make a mistake, it's going to work out for their good. Actually, the ark gets stolen and it crushes their enemies for them. They all get plagues exactly like the Egyptians, and the enemy actually ends up delivering the glory of God back to the people, which is what we're going to talk about next week. Think of the irony of that. Imagine that. There's part of me that wonders if we're living in a very, very similar time. I could be wrong. But there's a part of me that this looks eerily too similar. There is abuse of the people, a familiarity to the worship in the house of God that is unparalleled, so much to the point where we are abusing people all the while we call this our national symbol. As if that's the reason God's going to show up, because he shows partiality. Just because, it's not because we have a covenant. By the way, they don't understand even what that covenant is at that point. They just think that it's a national allegiance because God just loves us more because of our past, is what it seems to be saying, giving their attitude. Back to chapter 2, though. This is the main portion that I want to hit. What God took so seriously was how they handled the sacrifices. There are certain responsibilities that come with managing the house of God. And I'm going to be really vulnerable with you, as I always will really do my best to do. I think earlier this year, I had a very wrong definition of freedom. I think sometimes living in a country where freedom is everything, at least we say it is. It's everything. But yet there's this thing, if you were to ask me, Jamey, what do you see freedom as? I'd like to take a moment and ask you the same thing. Currently, when I just say the word freedom, what do you see in your mind? Don't say it out loud, but just get an image. Because you're not just hearing the word freedom. You're not just hearing the word F-R. You're not seeing that in your mind. There's an image that comes to mind when you hear the word freedom. There's an image. Just kind of be aware of what that image is. Because for me, if you were to ask Jamey Hammond, what is your image of freedom? Me and my community, we were talking about this. And I said, honestly, it's a life. We got a few different answers out of all of us. It's a life free of limits, honestly. Free of limitations. A life where no limits are imposed on me. It is a life where I do what I want to do because I'm free. And it is out of that freedom that I am led into more freedom. It is that freedom that empowers me to live a life of holiness, if you want to call it that way. That I'll treat people good, just nobody put limitations on me. And just to be honest with you, that was my definition of freedom. Maybe yours is different, but that was mine. A life free of limitations. There was another one that sounded really good, and honestly, it's a life where I don't have to pay any bills. Yep. Yeah, for sure. A life where I don't have to pay bills. I am free from the limitations put on me. I really did. I am so tired of paying bills, folks. I am. I'm tired of it. Just the other day, I mean, it's so hard. We work so hard to just work so hard to grow this beautiful life, but then you just get $4,000 worth of hospital bills it's like, come on, man. It's so hard to get $4,000. You know how much $4,000 cost me? You know how much a dollar costs me? I mean, $4,000 will cost me my life. It feels like that sometimes, you know? It's going to cost me time that I could spend with my marriage. It's going to cost me time that I could spend doing what I want to do in order to do what I have to do. It's annoying. It is. I'm just being honest. It's annoying. And maybe I'm new to it. I know I'm only 27 and you're like, I've been paying bills for a long time. Some of you, that's okay. But that being said, it's like, it's a life free of limitations to me sometimes. That's what freedom sounds like. But when I read this story, this is what checks me so hard, and this is what I needed to hear. That if I don't realize freedom itself carries a responsibility to manage freedom, I will start to see responsibility as limitation, and I will start to see limitation as a compromise to freedom. But what the sons of Eli did not understand is that with this freedom comes responsibility. But if I don't embrace the responsibility that freedom carries, I will actually compromise freedom because I did not receive the limits freedom brought with it. Limits do not compromise freedom. But I thought they did. I thought a life free of responsibility. I don't know where that came from. I don't know I don't know who to blame that image on. I take full responsibility, I guess, for that image. But I had an image of freedom that meant if I lived a life where I no longer had to do the things that I have to do. You know, those things that take time away from your kids, and that time that you could spend doing what you want to do, living in your passion, doing these things that are just purely annoying because they're being responsible or whatever it is. But isn't that exactly what happened in the Garden of Eden? This is a mirror of that. Do you remember at the beginning of this story when it said that it was the custom of the priests? It became a law. But this was never a law that God told them to do. Because when you do not embrace God's limits, you will impose your own. Oof. Oof. And it will be my own that break me. That was so good. Whoa. That if I do not embrace the limitations that God, isn't that essentially what Jesus is saying when he says, take my yoke upon you? See, a yoke looks heavy, but what he's saying is, if you take my gracious responsibility onto yourself, actually, it will be much lighter than if you impose your own limitations. Because if you don't receive the responsibility that came with the freedom that I gave you, then you will impose your own limits, and it will be the limits you impose that broke you. It was my limits that brought me to mental exhaustion near the end of this year. Remember what Eve said when she was about to eat from the tree? The serpent said, did God really say you couldn't eat from any tree? And she said, no, we can eat from the trees of the garden. Wrong. That's not what he said. He said, freely eat of every tree. So the first thing that he's going to try to take, some of you guys are looking at me like, what are you saying? So we're going to open up into Genesis chapter 2, just so that I show you I'm not just saying this. Are you guys with me tonight, though? Because this hit me. This hit me so deep, because as long as I see freedom being compromised by limitations, I will compromise freedom because I will impose my own limits on myself. So what ends up happening in Genesis is God says, freely eat of every tree, but only one tree don't eat from, and you will surely die, lest you surely, everyone say surely, surely die. But watch how Eve perceives this freedom. Genesis chapter 3, I didn't give them this scripture. Oh, thank you so much. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely, everyone say surely. Oof. You may surely, that same word is freely. You may freely eat of every tree of the garden. Verse 19. Or whatever the next verse is. Now out of the ground the Lord God, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat, you will surely die. So just kind of keep those two verses in the back of your head. I'm going to start to close on this, but watch how the devil or the serpent deceives Eve. Chapter 3, now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field. And he said to the woman, yeah, has God said you shall not eat of any tree? So do you see that the very first thing that the serpent tries to do, he imposes a new limit? I don't know if I can think of another definition for religion that's better than this. A failure to receive God's limitations, so we create our own. That's religion. That's religion. That's what that spiritual administration did. They started imposing their own law because they did not receive God's law. And what it ended up doing is it actually made the people hate. They hated worship. So not only does the spiritual leadership reject God's limitations and impose their own, but they are imposing their own limitations now on the people. Religion is not God's limitation, it is man's limitation. Let's be clear. Dead religion is man's limitation. Has God said you shall not eat of any tree? So the first thing God wants to ask is, or the first thing the devil asks is, can you not do anything? You can't do anything. God doesn't want you to have any pleasure, any joy, any fun, anything. No, nothing. And the woman said to the serpent, we can eat of the fruit of the... Wrong. No. He already switched her awareness. He already got her. No, because God said freely eat of every tree. She said, we can eat of the trees? No, we actually have some. We have some freedom. But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it. Did he say don't touch it? No. She imposed her own limitation. She imposed her own limitation because she did not recognize that. Isn't that crazy? Do you see how that rolled together there? That he says freely eat of every tree, but the only tree you don't eat from. So there's a responsibility that came with paradise. There's a responsibility that comes with heaven. Even if that's the whole thing that gets us sometimes, why it's so hard to be aware of heaven. Because how can heaven carry responsibility? Obviously it did, because why else would the devil fall? There is a responsibility to manage heaven, to manage the Ark of the Covenant. When God gives you something, and it's the same with everything else in our lives. God did not give me a wife so that I can just now, no, it takes management of that relationship. It takes management of my house. Whatever I got, whatever I received, if I don't receive the responsibility that came with that blessing, I will lose the blessing. If I don't embrace the limitations that came with the freedom, I will lose the freedom. Are you guys with me tonight? Because that hits me so deep in my chest. Because I've been rejecting some limitations. I've been rejecting some responsibilities. And honestly, it's made me, I impose my own limitations. I do. It leads to more mental exhaustion. I end up really tired. It's just crazy how it works, man. It's totally spun. This final point. I was asking God what he wanted to say tonight, because to be honest with you, there's so much happening in this story. There's a lot. Even the fact that they lost the Ark of the Covenant is a lot. That's a big deal. And honestly, I don't even really know what to make of that. There's a lot I don't understand about this story, and so I'm learning. But the first thing that I felt God speak clear to my heart is that religion will always be, it will always come from a failure to embrace the responsibility that came with the freedom that God gave you. So what's happening in this time is God is giving us a newfound freedom in our lives. And I pray that you become aware of it right now in your seats. There is a level of freedom you've never even experienced, and it's here and it's right now. But what happens with that freedom is you will also come into a new level of responsibility. It will carry, it requires a responsibility to manage this freedom that God has given. But you can't despise the responsibility thinking that it's compromising your freedom, because they will always grow in tandem. And this leads to my final thing. And this is the most serious part of it all. It means that how you got it is how you keep it. And that's the painful part. Because if you lost your life to get it, you're going to have to lose your life to keep it. If you had to kill yourself to get it, you're going to have to kill yourself to keep it. If you had to lose and compromise your whole self to get it, you will have to lose and compromise your whole self to keep it. How I paid for it is how I keep it. And so if I got the house by struggling, I will have to manage it by struggling. The same currency that I purchased my freedom with, I must also manage my freedom with. So the question is, how did I get what I got? And this is also why I'm grateful, because if grace gave it, then grace keeps it. And so that's why tonight what I'm asking you is maybe reevaluate some things, that if you're going to keep struggling in order to maintain that thing, then you're going to have to reverse the whole process. What I would encourage you to do, whatever it is in your life that you're struggling to upkeep, just take a moment right now and say, I receive that by grace. Isn't that what grace is? It's not just the thing that gives you something freely, it's the thing that manages it freely. It's a capacity to carry what I've already been given. That's what grace is. It's not just undeserved favor that freely gives it, it's undeserved favor that freely keeps it. So now I'm able to walk with a yoke that's light. I'm able to walk with the responsibility that doesn't kill me. I'm able to walk around with more confidence in my life. Why? Because take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Why? Because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He's saying if you embrace these limitations, you don't realize how easy it is. Because everything I ask from you, I supply through you. That's right. Everything that I asked from you in 2021, I already did it in you. And just the fact that I asked it from you tells you you already have it. So what we need to do as a church, as a community, is start to become aware of what God is asking from us and take it as evidence that it's already in me. Y'all are so quiet for how good I'm preaching right now. That it is a responsibility to carry what I got on the inside of me. Because why? If I really believe in what God has put in me, then yes, there's some responsibility that comes with that. I forget that sometimes, bro. It's easy to, though. Because sometimes responsibility, it's just like, come on, is this really freedom? But freedom, he said, the wheat and the weeds grow together. And if you tear out the weeds, you will tear out the wheat. If you remove the responsibility, you will also, if I remove the responsibility of managing my marriage, I will lose my marriage. If I remove the responsibility of managing my home, I will lose my home. But that does not mean I need to hate the responsibility, because when God gives me something, if I embrace the limits that come with that, if I embrace the responsibility that comes with that, the burden is easy, the yoke is light. I can live my life with my shoulders not so bent down, and it's not going to lead to a mental exhaustion breakdown. It's going to lead to me being full of energy, full of strength. I'm going to live my life with a different kind of strength than I've ever lived in. So now, you know what? I'm going to start to thank God for the things that I called weeds. I'm going to start to thank God for the things that I used to call limitations, the things that I used to think did not look like freedom. And I'm going to start to really, really just thank God for the things in my life that look like responsibility, but they're actually a gift in the form of limitation. Man fell because we did not embrace God's limits and we imposed our own. That's how we fell. So I want to say this. everyone under the sound of my voice, just take a moment to become aware of those things in your life recently you've seen responsibility get more intense. This week was the first time I started thanking God that I had the opportunity to pay a bill for my house. I said, you know what? I'm glad I have the opportunity to pay a bill because the bills came with the house. And the only reason I'm paying the bills is because I got a house that I can be grateful for. So if I can be grateful for the house, I can be grateful for the bills. And so, God, what I'm praying tonight, and I pray that this would hit you so deep in your chest that you would wake up to this new experience of freedom. Wake up. See it. Become aware of it. It's a choice. See it. How much you have in your life right now. It's only 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's more than enough. 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 And so now as we move forward throughout this week, we get to walk as if our yoke is light, as if, sure, it might not be a life where we don't have to pay bills anymore, but you get to walk around with that same kind of confidence, with this kind of responsibility on you. There's a responsibility that has come with the freedom that God has given us. And my prayer tonight is that you all of us as a family would receive this responsibility and just say, God, our whole lives, give it all by grace. Give it all by grace. We receive everything that we have in our lives by grace. We didn't struggle for it. We didn't strive for it. We didn't sweat for it. I'm grateful that it's not going to take our sweat and our blood to maintain what we have, because it is not our sweat and our blood that bought what we have. That it is the blood of another. It is the sweat of another. It is the sweat of the blood. It is the sweat of someone else. I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Jesus' blood redeems whatever it touches. What's the first thing it touches? Sweat. What is sweat? It's the curse of work. Oof. It's the curse of responsibility. He says, now you're going to have to bleed through responsibility. But now what Jesus has done is he has redeemed us from sweating to not only get our blessings, but to maintain our blessings. We're free from sweat. Oh. So we receive it all without sweat, and we keep it without sweat. In Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, I hope that you like this, because it hit me deep. It hit me really, really, really deep. And just take this next week and really, all of us, I'd encourage us just to start to become aware of how good God is, even in those things that we called responsibilities, even in those things we were like, man, this is annoying. Let's all embrace it, because with that responsibility, God has also given freedom. And so if we embrace it, I believe we'll live fully into it. Thank you so much for listening tonight. I love you.